And welcome to Titanic Legacy, a podcast that explores Titanic's lasting impact through conversations with today's creators, authors, artists, filmmakers, musicians, experts, historians, entrepreneurs, all continuing to produce creative work inspired by the Ship of Dreams. If you're tuning in at home, doing chores, driving to work, at the gym, however, whenever, wherever you are listening, thank you for giving us your time and welcoming us into your lives for the next half hour or so as we talk about Titanic and her long-lasting creative inspiration and impact. This is Titanic Legacy, the podcast. I'm your host, Paul Carganilla, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with the host of another new-ish Titanic podcast, Mr. James Penca. But before we welcome him aboard, let me tell you all a little bit about Mr. Penca. He is a Titanic Researcher and Spokesperson with RMS Titanic Inc. He's also the Creative Director of Titanic Honor and Glory and the host of the Witness Titanic Podcast. He was also recently on board the Expedition 2024 as a researcher. This expedition, of course, has made a splash in the news lately with recent discoveries and is being talked about all over the Titanic community. And from podcasts and expeditions and even musical theater, we have much in common and a lot to chat about. So little time, so let's not waste any more of it. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the Titanic Legacy podcast, Mr. James Penca.
Oh, I love the applause.
Gotta bring you in properly with a proper welcome. It is great to connect with you today. We were just chatting briefly. We just met for the very first time for anybody out
there.
That's
right.
We're both here in SoCal. So in so many of these episodes, I've been talking to somebody on the other side of the world. So
right.
It's nice to have another SoCal, not native, but resident here on the pod. It's great to connect with you. I was just telling you, I've been a consumer of Titanic podcasts for years. And like you, I'm relatively new to the podcast community, Titanic community as a host, but I've been listening for years, and I actually met you maybe like 3 years ago. You were a guest on Titanic, Loretta Ann Miller's
right.
podcast.
Yeah. Okay.
And then, a few years go by, and then you pop up on Titanic Talk with Alexandra Boyd and Nelson Aspin. And we've developed friendship, Alexandra and Nelson and I. And you worked on Ship of Dreams, Alexandra's film,
right?
Which we've actually talked to her about on this show, and can't wait to pick your brain about that as well. But then, of course, I stumble across this new podcast called Witness Titanic, and I'm like, here's James Penca again, and he's hosting his own show. But before we get into that, and that's the main reason we're here, to talk about your new podcast, but let's rewind for anyone who's just meeting you for the first time in this conversation. Who is James Penca, and what in your life brought you to Titanic?
Oh boy. I usually ask that question to my guests. So I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. Originally, I spent the last 10 years living in New York City, sort of pursuing the stage acting career. But throughout all of that time, I've been doing Titanic stuff sort of behind the scenes, and that's sort of grown in the last few years, obviously. But what got me into Titanic originally, when I was 6 years old, so when I was 6 years old, I saw the movie. That was my first exposure, and the movie was great. My family loved it. I think we went back and saw it again, which was a big deal for our family to do that. But it wasn't that sort of bit me. But it was a year later when I played Titanic Adventure Out of Time, which I have my little strategy guide on the shelf. I played that game. It was a PC game. Many people listening probably know the game I'm talking about. And that's what absolutely blew my mind. I never stopped thinking about Titanic since then. And that's why it's so proudly on my bookshelf, because I owe that project, I owe that game my livelihood, basically. So that got me into Titanic. I loved it ever since. I went to an RMS Titanic Incorporated artifact exhibition when I was 10, and then that sealed the deal for sure. Never going to let go of Titanic after that. And then here I am at 33 years old, still talking about Titanic.
What brought you to your first Titanic employment?
Yeah, so it's kind of a long roundabout way, but when I was actually doing my first show in New York City, a terrible, terrible musical that no one came to see, and the one of the people in the show, he was the first person I had ever met who also played Adventure Out of Time when they were a young lad. So we used to talk about Titanic all the time, and he said to me, "Have you heard there's a group trying to remake Adventure Out of Time, but with modern graphics?" So I looked it up. And by that point, they had already moved on from that idea and they were making their own video game called Titanic Honor and Glory. I reached out that day. I emailed them immediately and said, "Listen, I'm a longtime Titanic enthusiast. I was inspired by the same game you were inspired by. I play video games avidly. I'm an actor. I want to be a voice actor. I think I'm a writer. Like I offered anything that I do. I think I'm perfect to help you make this project." And they agreed, thankfully. And for the next like decade, I worked with them on the exterior, just like not the exterior of the ship. I was very much on the outside, but I helped when I could. I did a voice for this. I did a voice for that. At one point, I offered to write the script, and I started writing that a little bit. And so, but it wasn't until COVID when the project was really stalling that I offered to step in and take over and come up with a new vision for the project, focus more on the history of Titanic, less on the video game fun aspect. Sort of revamped the company. This got the attention of RMS Titanic Incorporated, who wanted to work with us previously, but couldn't because the people in charge just they didn't like the video game of Titanic. That seemed kind of insensitive. But once we were proudly proclaiming that we had changed the game into a museum, like a virtual museum, as opposed to a video game with like killing and romance and drama, like it was just history. They were like, "Let's work together." So we worked together for about a year. That led to a job with the company, which led to the expedition this past summer.
Can't wait to dig into all of that. But let's talk
Yeah.
about that game element for just a second, because I
Sure.
happen to have on my shelf the Titanic movie board game. I've never opened it, but I
Oh
found
my
it
gosh.
on clearance in the mall one day and I was like, I'm buying this. And it did occur to me, like, how can you try and make an entertainment? How can you? I mean, but it's probably the same question that everybody was asking James Cameron back in the day. How can you
Exactly.
propose to make money out of something entertaining surrounding this disaster? And it's interesting with Honor and Glory. So many people I've talked to about it, they go, "Yeah, what is that? Is it a video game or is it just like ship tours on
Right.
YouTube?" Um,
Yeah, we have a whole slew of complications with the project and people understanding what it is, which is our own fault. And it was just sort of the nature of it because for 10 years it was run by a group of people, some of which are still with the project, some of which aren't. But the vision was very much to make a video game. That was the number one goal, was to make an entertaining video game. And we did get some flack for that. Because it's hard to make a game, like you said, out of a disaster. I think James Cameron gets it's a little bit easier to make a movie because at the end of the day, it's just a story. You're storytelling. That's what we all do. The second you make it into a board game or a video game, it starts to bring about some issues. So when I took over and we sort of rearranged the team and started to get a little bit more progress, the focus was on the history of it. But I would say it also doesn't help that we had a video go viral back in 2017. Our real-time syncing video, I think it's up to 90 million views or something like that.
mhm.
All of those people, 90 million people, heard about this video game. So no matter how much we talk about the virtual museum that we're making and like how the project has really shifted to be about history and how we actually don't just make that project, like we're a research team. We went on the expedition. We helped find artifacts. Like, we are much more than a video game studio. There's still 90 million people who think we're making a video game. And so there's just, it is a never ending uphill climb to try to get people on board. And at the end of the day, that will not change until we release a virtual museum project, which is always a struggle, but we work on it every day.
I want to talk about that work too. But first, I want to say hello to everybody who's watching in the live stream. If you have any questions for James before the end of this half hour is up, we'll be happy to ask him. Just drop it in the live chat. DW checks into the live chat. He says, "Hi, Paul. Finally get to see one of these live recordings. I love your interviews. Thank you very much." And he says, just discovered James's podcast, which is also fantastic. Thank you both for doing these for us.
Thank you.
Titaniacs or
That's
Titanic
right.
enthusiasts. Well, so, and forgive me if I missed it, if you said it and I missed it. What did you major in college?
I majored in music theater,
And
so
you're working on
Broadway.
a Titanic video game, and
Yeah.
and that leads you to this job now at RMS Titanic, and we'll get to that. But isn't it interesting? And this is something that I talk about. I just started this particular Titanic specific podcast this past summer, but I've been podcasting about uh, but talking to entertainers and creators who
Yeah.
just are putting out new work and following their passions. And we have these conversations about how important it is to follow your heart's fire and follow your passions. Of course, it is an ultimate blessing to be paid to do what you love,
Mhm.
and that's the goal I think that everybody in the world has. But when you're following your heart, doors open and you walk through them, and new opportunities come about. Now you can't go into it with reckless abandon, obviously, but your story just sounds like, your passion for Titanic has taken you on a path that the very unlikely path to where you are now. And now you're working for RMS Titanic Incorporated. What do you do there?
So I originally the biggest benefit that I provided RMST initially when I was just working as like a contractor, I wasn't like a full employee yet, was just as a spokesperson, and mostly just a spokesperson. So what happens is RMST has 6 or 7 exhibits that travel around the world. Like right now, I think there's one in Columbus. There's one in Switzerland opening in a couple weeks. We just opened one in Poland last week, or this week, I think. So they're all over the world. And what they do is they fly me to the venue to do press. So all like on a certain day of the week, all the local newspapers come. They walk around. I'm there to answer questions. It's always the same questions. It's always why is Titanic so interesting 100 years later? And the same question over and over and over again. But that's what I did for them, and I still do. I didn't go to Poland and I didn't go to Switzerland, but I went to Melbourne, I went to Brussels. So they fly me around, which is just a joy to be able to go to these and walk around them and be there to talk on the news. I go on the local news, like the channels and stuff. So I have a good time doing that. And then with the expedition, I've been all over the BBC, NPR, stuff like that. But the other side of what I do as a researcher is the company is constantly putting out content on social media. They want to do more on that side, but also they still have their exhibits that honestly haven't been updated in a decade. There are a lot of Titanic people who I see posting on Facebook, like they'll be at an exhibit and they'll take a picture of a fact that's just not correct. And I know about it, the whole team knows about it, but the information boards haven't been updated in forever. And so we've been going through them, editing them, trying to mount a sort of a redo of some of that. It's some of the text is even dated in that you can tell it was written in the 90s based on the words they use. Like that's how outdated they are. So we're working on updating all of that. So just providing the company with a historic background. I'm not the world's leading Titanic historian or anything like that. That's why I prefer to be called a researcher. But I certainly know how to tell Titanic story, whether that's on the news or through text. And so that's what I do for the company.
I see a lot of parallels between you and I. I was a theater major. I don't think I told you that, but I was as
Hmm.
well. And now I have a government job. I work as my official title is community affairs manager for a local police department. So, but I'm not a sworn officer. So I'm kind of the spokesperson for this agency, but I'm not a cop. And
Right.
so I wonder if you get the same kind of friction at times where people, they'll reach out and they'll want to ask me questions, and I say, yeah, let me get an officer or a sergeant to answer that for you. I'm the PIO, the public information officer, and they're like, oh, so you're not even like an officer. Ugh. So when you threw air quotes around researcher, I wondered if you get that kind of friction or flack when you're out there uh, contacting public agencies. Are they ever like, well, can I talk to an actual historian or researcher?
No, the honestly, the air quotes and the friction that I experience is not through my job. When I speak with the press, when I speak with people through my job, they are perfectly happy. I can answer any question that they have. I rarely have to check with anybody else. Um, I consider myself a pretty solid authority on certainly anything that a local newspaper is going to ask me. If someone asks me a very, very specific question, I might turn to the guys at THG and say, "Hey, does anybody know the answer to this?" And then like a minute later, I've got 17 correct answers. So, that works well. I have got a great research team behind me. When I do this, it's the friction of the Titanic community. As you may know, as many people listening may know, the Titanic community is very intense. And so I've seen others call themselves historians and live to regret it. You can't. I don't want to put myself on any pedestal. I actually insisted that RMST not make me a historian, which is what they wanted to do. They wanted me to be their historian, but I just don't feel comfortable with that. I've not written a book. I've not gone to school for history, so researcher is plenty good by me.
I totally get that. And as someone who recently, I've been an observer of all things Titanic for many years. And I just recently, this past summer, kind of dipped my toes into this community. And I quickly learned that the deeper you dive, there's a very, I don't want to call it aggressive, but territorial atmosphere among
Extremely.
so many different groups of people who all love the same thing.
Yes, we all love the same exact thing, and we should be getting along and supporting each other. And there is a lot of that. I end every one of my episodes with "Be nice to each other, Titanic community," because because it needs to be said. There are people in the community who were lifelong friends who no longer speak because they can't agree on how many rockets were launched. Like it's absolutely absurd, but it all comes back to territorial. It all comes back to like I am the person who knows this, and I need to be that, and so it gets complicated. But there are so many wonderful people in the Titanic community that I've interacted with, people who have written books, people who've done incredible things for our community, who are just very nice and chill, and they understand that sharing Titanic knowledge is part of the job, not withholding all of it.
I love how, and we're kind of beautifully segueing into talking about your podcast, but in your first episode, you say, let's look at exactly the facts that we know and go from there.
Yeah.
And that is so important. And I do want to ask you other questions on this theme. But first, as we're almost in our last 10 minutes here, I want to get to the podcast. That's why we're here. That's why we're doing this. For anyone who hasn't heard about Witness Titanic, how do you pitch it to them?
It is a modern inquiry. I've been wanting to have a Titanic podcast forever, but I could never take the step because stepping out and starting something like this, you really do open yourself up to the negativity. But also because I just didn't have the thing that I wanted, the framework of it. Do I just want to talk about a random topic every day? Then it all just kind of clicked one day that what I should do is interview people who know a lot about Titanic some of the time, but the majority of the episodes, I want to dissect the testimony of passengers and crew who survived, and some victims, because there is some testimony that survives from victims in a way. So it is just a deep dive into the words and writings of people who witnessed it firsthand, and then the people who witness it every day today, like you and I, like we witness Titanic all the time. I was just on an expedition, so I certainly witnessed Titanic quite a bit this year. But yeah, so it's a modern inquiry. There were two inquiries back in 1912 on both sides of the Atlantic, and I don't actually think we're doing like a government level inquiry. It's just a framing device, but I do think of it as an investigation to learn everything we can about Titanic from the people who know what they're talking about, regardless of their status.
Did you start it, or was it an idea that the RMS Titanic wanted to do?
It was kind of well, it was encouragement from RMST. So I had the idea of doing a podcast. My wife and I were actually going to do a like co-host thing where because she knows nothing about Titanic, and she's a stand-up comedian type. So it'd be just kind of a fun duo. But I just couldn't pull the trigger. I never got excited about it until I was talking to RMST about the upcoming expedition. And I happened to mention that I really want to do a podcast at some point. And they were like, yeah, you should do that. And you should interview people going on the expedition. And I was like, oh, I've never thought about interviewing people like in present day. I've only ever thought about talking about Titanic or my favorite topic of all, which is the writings and the words of survivors. And so that started making things click. And then I thought of the inquiry angle. And so it was just really through their encouragement and saying like, yeah, if you want to interview people who are going on the expedition, you totally can. And then I ended up being one of the people going on the expedition. And so they graciously allowed me to do interviews from the expedition, which really was like, okay, that makes that decision. I guess I'm starting this podcast now. So
I don't want to ruin anything, because one of my pet peeves is asking people questions that they can hear answers to on another podcast. But, I don't want to just like, reveal your podcast. And if anybody wants to do a deep dive on any of these, I do encourage you to give it a listen. Drop in on Witness Titanic and listen to the work that James is doing over there. And you did a shorter episode from when you got to the expedition site.
Mhm.
And that was the question I want to touch on. People, of course, I just mentioned, can go listen to the full episode, but I had the absolute blessing of going to Belfast about a month ago, and being in the space. We stayed in the Harland and Wolff in the Titanic Hotel, Belfast.
Amazing.
And being in Thomas Andrews' office, being on the shipyard, and in those spaces was just such an amazing thing. You just sit and you imagine the sights and the smells and the energy that was there in 1911, 1912. And I think we went to Cove, of course, got to do that as well. But at the end of the trip, my wife said, "Where else would you want to go?" Southampton, Liverpool. And I'm like, you know what? That would be cool. Halifax would be cool. But like, if I got to go to one more place, it would be probably where she went down,
Right.
Over the wreck. And so for you described that, of course, on the podcast, but can you give us just a taste of what it was like after being so passionate about Titanic your whole life to be there?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I've been to Belfast as well, and Southampton and all those places. And each time, like you said, yeah, there's something special about being there. Arriving at the wreck site was complicated emotionally, because we got there in the middle of the day, which you never think about that spot during the day. It's always at night in your head. So we got there at noon or something like that. And so that was odd. And you arrive, and because we were on the expedition, we got to get to work. Like we arrived, there was like a second to think about it. And then I had to set up GoPro cameras everywhere to capture the launching of the ROVs. Like we had a lot of work to do. There was no time on this 20-day expedition. There was no time to like be all emotional if you wanted to be. Like you could do that later kind of thing. But luckily I did take a moment. I went outside on deck and just looked out, and it happened somewhere within my eyesight. That's the other thing about it. Like, yes, the first day we were positioned directly over um, part of the debris field. So we weren't even over the stern or the bow necessarily. And even then, how did the ship plane away from the spot? So like you can assume it's somewhere in eyesight, but you aren't actually in the spot. And then to add on to that, the water is different, the air is different, the sea level is even different from 1912, I would assume. So there's actually very little about where you are that makes you feel like you're there. The thing that made my brain understand it, though, was looking over the edge of the boat and looking into the water and understanding that directly below me is the wreck. That is what hits you in the heart and makes your eyes well up. And that feeling was really incredible. And even laying in bed at night, I was on the lowest deck of the ship. And so beneath my bed was some engine spaces and then the bottom of the boat. So I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm laying down so close to the actual wreck, and that still gets like has the hair stand up on the back of your neck. So it's not necessarily the spot, but it is what is underneath you that really, at least that was how I experienced it. Other people who have been there have said that every time they're there, they feel a certain something. I didn't feel anything about the air around us. It was what was down below.
Incredible. And as we are recording this, he has, it looks like 11 episodes of Witness Titanic that have dropped. He goes over historic, as he mentions, historic figures, Lightoller, Bruce Ismay, but he also talks to the people on the expedition. Dr. Gallo, I'm hoping to get him on this show as well. Rory Golden, that was a great episode. And the most recent one is about what's in the newspapers today. Diana, Versailles, you describe how the whole process of that rediscovery. And I will recommend it again to anyone who is interested in hearing the whole process as you talk all about your experience, which is awesome. How has this new experience of producing a Titanic podcast been for you?
It's a whole, oh man, it's a lot of work, as I'm sure you know. I definitely have like an OCD perfectionist side when it comes to the things that I do with the things that I love. One of my other passions is the Beatles, and during COVID I did a similar project, a virtual I went through their catalog one song at a time and uploaded a video, and I would drive myself crazy making these videos perfect and editing them to extreme degrees. And so I told myself when I started this I would not fall into that, and it's just so hard not to. With the interview ones, they're a little easier. I interview somebody, I cut out some of the and I do this really annoying thing where I swallow in the middle of a sentence and it sounds awful on a microphone. So I cut those out. So there's a little bit of work needed. Getting it up online is complicated and making sure everybody knows about it. But the interviews that I do with the survivors, where I do voices for the survivor and the senator interviewing them. So there's a little bit of a back and forth. Those can take days to edit. And I do need to come up with a more sustainable way of making them. I made like 7 of them before I put up a single one, but now I've caught up. So I have an episode due out on Tuesday that I was working on earlier. And it's like, oh my gosh, I need to work over the weekend on this, and my wife's not going to be happy. So I do need to come up with a more sustainable way to do it, because I want to put so much work into it, because I want these episodes to be amazing. And so far, people have been so kind. Speaking of the Titanic community being nice, I've gotten of course, a few little comments about people disagreeing with me, especially with the Diana episode, because there's obviously it's a very touchy subject, but generally, I'd say 99% of the comments have just been the sweetest, most uplifting things. So it'll give me the energy to keep going.
I'm assuming the touchy parts at the end, or your quotes in the recent articles about her being proof that she needs to come up.
Yes, and on that topic actually, and I'm happy to talk about this. I know where you said like 30 minutes or so. I'm happy to talk as long as you'd like. I've got nothing to do aside from work more on the podcast. Yeah, so that interview, I try not to talk about the whole gravesite issue because it is so polarizing. Doesn't matter what I say, that it'll be polarizing no matter what. And of course, they asked that one question. I answered it really quickly, and then we moved on. And of course, that's one of the questions that made it into the article. And then that's a question that people have pointed at. Yeah, I mean, but I stand by it regardless. And it's a big topic in the Diana episode. If people listen to it, there's so many reasons that people believe that we should leave Titanic alone, and I've never felt that way. Partially because when I was 10 years old and I saw these artifacts in person, it really changed me as a person. I just read a comment on one of my episodes of somebody who saw the artifacts. For the first time, broke down crying, and they've never stopped thinking about it since then. Like there's just so many people. Easiest way to put it is I get messages from people who will tell you that Titanic saved them, and these artifacts are what inspired them and sort of saved them and gave them their life's passion or gave them a focus in school. It's just at the point where you could argue that these artifacts have saved more people than were lost on Titanic. It's just such a joyous thing to me, these artifacts, what they can bring us, the joy they can bring us. And so yes, I've never felt that Titanic should be left alone. I think it should be respected in every way and should not be touched if you can avoid it. We only take artifacts from the debris field and that stuff. So I think it should be respected in every way. I love that ship and I love the people and everything, but I also see the joy that these exhibits bring people, and the faces of kids coming in on a field trip, seeing artifacts, and I can see in their eyes that they are having a day they will never forget. That's really special to me.
So powerful. And in your role at RMSTI, do you control when press releases go out, or like the timing of announcements and stuff like that? Or are you more just like an ambassador and with a deep well of knowledge?
I'm really just there to they tell me where the cameras will be and the press will be, and I prepare and I speak. With this Diana story, however, because myself and the Titanic Honor and Glory team were so close to the process. It was the THG guys who spotted Diana in old footage.
Mhm.
And then I led the excursions to go find her. So we literally found her with RMST. So it was very much part of very, very close to us. So I was very close on the process of releasing the information, and the only time I think I've ever picked when something would happen is I did tell the company. I was like, well, the anniversary of the discovery of the wreck is coming up on September 1st, so that might be a nice day to release the information. And I think we ended up putting everything out on September 2nd. So, but aside from that, I really don't have any control over what is said or where it's said. But I did write some of the press release, not all of it. I did the historic side of the Diana stuff.
From the YouTube chat, DW wants to know if there's going to be a documentary made about your expedition with your GoPros and everything that you were doing out there.
Well, yeah, we filmed a lot. A lot of that ended up on social media. One of the really cool things that RMST let us do, or wanted us to, they didn't let us do, it was their idea. They wanted, for the first time, these expeditions are always very closed door. You do not get to see anything. and you almost never get to see anything ever. It's just decades go by, and you go, why did they never release the footage from that? So this expedition, they gave me a couple GoPros, and they gave me access to the RMST Instagram and said, film whatever you want. Let's let people come on the expedition for the first time. So we did that. So a lot of that GoPro footage I took is already out there, but there's always a hope that we can do some sort of longer thing. I don't know personally, but we did get a lot of footage, so it'd be really cool to make something out of it.
My last question, and I'll let you go. We'll come back around to the creative aspect of everything. Through this podcast, I love to explore ways in which Titanic continues to creatively inspire people. That's why I'm here. And I was actually having a conversation with Don Lynch on my other show before I started this show. And he said something that I found to be really interesting. He said people who are writing a fictional piece on Titanic will come to him to check it for historical accuracy. And he said the irony in that is so profound, because you want me to read your fictional work for historical accuracy. And so that kind of just got me thinking, with all of the fiction that we're creating these days, obviously James Cameron's fiction did a lot for Titanic's legacy and the community, and all the historical work that continues to be done. What are your feelings on how it seems like, you and I are both examples of it. New shows are starting up every other week. New books are coming out. New movies are being made with both fiction and non being created. Do you feel like we're doing justice to Titanic's legacy in all of this work that we're doing? Or is there a chance that we're watering it down or muddying the waters a little bit?
That's an interesting question. For me, Titanic is the ultimate story. It's the greatest story of all time, fictional or otherwise. I say that all the time with these newspapers when they ask me, why is Titanic still, so many years later? It's the greatest story of all time, and we love a good story. And so we will constantly try to tell that story over and over again in movies, in documentaries, and whatever. I'm sort of in the mindset of the more the better, assuming that what is being made is, people are actually putting some effort into it. I mean, I just saw somebody people will steal each other's stuff and share it as their own. People will, you go on TikTok and you'll find 1 million Titanic videos with absolutely no research done behind them, and it's clearly wrong, and it's old myths that have been debunked 1 million times. And so it's certainly not the more the better, because there is a lot out there that shouldn't be out there. But if you're somebody who has a passion for Titanic, and you respect it and you love it, and you're going to do the work to properly research it and tell the story in a new way, that is, for me, the more the better. I don't think you can ever water down the story. It'll always be a fascinating tale.
Well, I asked you for 30 minutes and I took a lot more. So thank you so much.
I don't mind at all.
Hanging out with us again. In case you missed it, his podcast is Witness Titanic. Check it out. YouTube, Apple Podcasts, probably anywhere you can find podcasts, I assume.
Everywhere.
Before we wish everybody happy Titanic trails, I'd also like to ask all of our friends who enjoyed this conversation to subscribe to the Titanic Book Club newsletter and YouTube channel. The links are in the show notes of this episode. And if you enjoyed the episode, please be sure to subscribe, rate, leave a positive review on your favorite podcast platform. If you love conversations with creators, find my other podcast, covepod. Please give that a listen if you're interested. I want to say thank you one more time to our guest today, James Penca. And thank you all for tuning in. Until next episode, seize the day. Follow your heart's fire and make each day count.